Thank you for joining us for our final presentation in this series of AAI Lightning Lectures. Our speaker today is Phillip Bigger, UCD Final Year Masters student, who is going to describe Donald Trump's draft executive order, Making Federal Buildings Beautiful Again, which is actually its title, and it was just issued in February of this year. We're discussing this on the safe harbor date of the federal election in the United States, the day beyond which state determinations of their electoral votes cannot be challenged and are protected by federal law. But while his ambitions have been put on hold, it is likely that Trumpism will return sooner or later. And so Phillip is going to show us what that has planned for the architectural profession. So hi, Phillip. Thanks for joining us today. And I'll hand over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. So, I'm Phillip Bigger. I'm a Master of Architecture student at UCD. And as Orla has already said, I'm going to be discussing the executive order that Trump released by accident in February entitled Making Federal Buildings Beautiful Again. And just as Orla said, today is Safe Harbor Day. So that is for the Electoral College, the last day that election disputes can be kind of compromised. So it's an apropos time really to discuss what implications the executive order has for architecture as a profession and sort of what it points to Trump's impact on American democracy. So with that being said, I'll just start with the beginning of the executive order, which states that the founding fathers modeled the principal buildings in Washington, D.C. on that of democratic Athens and Republican Rome in order to physically symbolize the then new nation's self-governing ideals, resulting in beloved and beautiful buildings for around 150 years. That is until the government started using a style called brutalist, which the executive order defines as the architectural style that grew out of the early 20th century modernist movement that is characterized by a massive, monolithic, stark, and block-like appearance with a rigid geometric style and large-scale use of exposed poured concrete. And the executive order outlines a couple of buildings that the public found uninspiring or just plain ugly, including this one, the Department of Health and Human Services building, the Department of Labor building, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development building. A review in 1994 resulted in the creation of something called the Design Excellence Program. However, this seems to have only made matters worse by introducing deconstructivism, which the executive order defines as the style that subverts the traditional values of architecture via fragmentation, disorder, discontinuity, distortion, skewed geometry, and the appearance of instability. And this resulted in buildings like the San Francisco Federal Building, the Austin U.S. Courthouse, and the Wilkie D. Ferguson Jr. Courthouse in Miami. The order concludes that the federal government has largely stopped making beautiful buildings that the American people want to look at or work in. One thing that can be noticed right off with the buildings that are named in the executive order is that in most popular opinion, they could be considered pretty ugly. For example, going back to the San Francisco Federal Building, the massive hole in the center of the building makes it look as if it's been hit by some sort of precision terrorist attack by the architects themselves, which is morphosis. However, in this example and others, it can be argued that the unlovedness and therefore unloveliness of these buildings cannot be solely attributed to their being in a brutalist or deconstructivist style. For example, Boston City Hall, which is unquestionably brutalist, and it may not be loved by the public, but you have to admit that there is a degree of stylistic rigor, which could be said in the words of the executive order, to provide visual testimony to the dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability of American government. And while another example would be Frank Gehry's recently opened Eisenhower Memorial, which for the last 12 years has been crusaded against by the likes of the National Civic Arts Society, which is a key contributor to the executive order. While it's undoubtedly deconstructivist, It appears to have been well received since its opening and therefore can be considered to be loved. Among the buildings that are named and shamed in the executive order, 4 buildings are dedicated to social welfare. And the only recent building given praise in the executive order is a building assigned to law enforcement, which is the Tuscaloosa Federal Building and Courthouse, which is clad in a neoclassical style. It does not require stretch of the imagination to suspect that the distrust of these brutalist monoliths lies in their being part of American social democracy. Trump is just the latest and most vivid representative of the Republican attack on the Republic since Ronald Reagan in 1975 went on the Johnny Carson show and stated that people look to the government for the solution to the problem, when in fact government is the problem. Yet what has been made completely clear from the outset is that it is not government per se, which is the Republican Party wants rid of, but rather the welfare state. Ultimately, these policies culminated in the tragic terrorist attack on the Oklahoma City building in 1995, which was carried out by a member of the same white supremacist movement which Trump had provided a platform for and has provided a platform for in recent years, thus revealing the racist basis for this war on social welfare. And thus leads me to the last observation I would like to make regarding the executive order. So the existing guidelines for the federal architecture fall under the purview of the General Services Administration. And this actually happens to be the same organization that has recently, until recently, was preventing President-elect Joe Biden from moving forward with the transition process. And they administer guidelines for federal architecture via the 1962 Guiding Principles, which was outlined by Daniel Patrick Moynihan during the Kennedy administration, the man on the right-hand side of the slide here. And key to the guiding principles was this idea from Pericles, the statue on the left over here, stating that we do not imitate, for we are a model to others. And this is further enforced in the guiding principles with the idea that the development of an official style must be avoided. Design must flow from the architectural profession to the government and not vice versa. Under the proposed 2020 executive order, however, architects are to be explicitly banned from this process. So just reading from the executive order, with respect to the public panels, participants shall not include artists, architects, engineers, art or architecture critics, members of the building industry, or any other members of the public that are affiliated with any interest group or organization involved with the design, construction, or otherwise directly affected by the construction or remodeling of the building. So the system that would be put in place for determining acceptable project is established in such a manner as to all but eliminate any chance of nonconformist architecture from being built. The President's Committee that would be established for the rebeautification of federal architecture would be comprised of the Commissioner of the General Services Administration, Public Building Services, at least one member of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, who would be designated by the President, and of which there are now 2 members of the National Civic Arts Society, a part of it, who one is the President, Justin Chabot, and such other officers or employees of the federal government designated for the participation by the President. This panel is not only grossly biased against anything but traditional or classical architecture, but also flatly denies the right of architects to legislate their own sphere, free from subordination or to religious or political interests. Their attitude toward modern and contemporary architecture as a degenerate art form responsible for the downfall of Western society is alarmingly close to that held by Albert Speer during Hitler's war on cultural identity. Just as Trump supporters seek to purge Washington of political leaks, the President's Committee seeks to purge architectural elite from the realm of federal architecture. This was best expressed by Marion Smith making a statement about the executive order, stating, "For too long, architectural elites and bureaucrats have denied the idea of beauty, blatantly ignored public opinions on style, and have quietly spent taxpayer money constructing ugly, expensive, and inefficient buildings. The executive order gives voice to the 99%, the ordinary American people who do not like what their government has been building. This wholesale eviction of elites from every facet of American government has served to unravel American democracy and weaken civic institutions such as the EPA, the Department of Education, the judicial system, and most recently and urgently, the CDC during the recent pandemic through instilling suspicion of science. So it does not take, so it's not surprised that the same tactics of subversion have come face to face with the architecture profession. American democracy is at an inflection point where it will either snap under the pressures of the most authoritarian regime America has seen since in its over 2-century existence, or bounce back from the abyss damaged and very much compromised, but not destroyed. The last 4 years under Trump were the culmination of over 40 years of corrosive capitalism, pitting the haves versus the have-nots and exasperating chasm of differences between the two. By tapping into the frustration of his base toward the Washington elites, Trump has been able to systematically restrict, if not completely nullify, the autonomy of countless civic institutions, all in the name of making America great again. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Mark, thanks for turning your camera on. Would you mind introducing yourself briefly and then explaining how this topic has sort of come up between you and how this thesis has come about?
Thanks, Orla. Yeah, my name is Mark Price and I'm a tutor in UCD School of Architecture, and Philip was assigned to me this year for his dissertation, and he drew my attention to this executive order, and I thought, yeah, this is a great one. This is a real sign of the latent fascism of the Trumpist movement. Mm-hmm. And you know, people I'd mentioned this to said, oh, but why is Trump interested in architecture? Well, authoritarians are interested in architecture, and so this was a really interesting topic in a general sense. Some of the references to the Nazis are obviously a bit extreme, but probably not misplaced. Mm. So anyway, we're talking to you, Orla, and you said, oh, why don't you ask Philip to do a talk? So, and he's done a great job. Philip, thank you. You really explained it.
You have. I suppose I wanted to ask about is it a denial or kind of a manufactured idea from an idealistic past, that idea that you can use architecture as a tool to make something great again, but that thing has never really existed? And is that, like, I suppose, is that where different fascist regimes find commonality? Is there that element of referencing a non-existent past or future? I suppose that's to both of you.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is that architecture I would consider as inherently political. And even if someone says that there's no political statement in whatever the architecture might be, that is inherently political. So as architecture plays a massive role in sort of, you know, our built environment and consequently how people interact with the city and people around them, it's easy for architecture to become manipulated, either willingly or unwillingly, by different regimes throughout history to propagate their own motivations. I mean, this is using in terms of executive order, Trump is trying to impose a classical, traditional federal style of architecture. Whereas in, say, during Mussolini in fascist Italy, it was actually the MIAR and the architects that were trying to push for the establishment of a federal style of architecture within Italy. So it kind of goes both ways, with either the architecture profession influencing the political content of its creations or the regimes themselves imbuing their own views within the profession. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, so I guess in both circumstances, architects mm-hmm. are complicit to a certain degree.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Either by choice or by influence. Great.
Yeah. It's going to be always part of the ideological apparatus architecture, mm-hmm. because the state becomes represented in these objects, these buildings, these federal buildings. So they carry a weight of ideology and a weight of needing to naturalize. And so I think it's very interesting, Philip's talk, like the things like the San Francisco Federal Building, like, which really don't come off, arguably, and you can see how they really don't step up to the mark of having that kind of seriousness that state buildings probably need to have. But Boston City Hall does, arguably. You can say that it's not brutalism or deconstructism per se that prevents this. It's just failures within particular styles rather than particular styles.
Yeah. And in terms of what you mentioned about architects and anyone associated with the procurement, construction, design, anything to do with buildings being excluded from the commissioning process. I don't know, it just seems very bizarre to me in the way that you can identify people for whom buildings don't touch their lives. Like, that's not true. Everyone in something.
That was when I was first reading through the executive order. Like, a lot of their opinions on style, that's whatever. But that one section about excluding explicitly certain people from the discussion is what really kind of got me interested, and I think Mark as well, interested in exploring the executive order further.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've been looking at is the Helene Lipstadt's essay, pretty well-known essay on the competition for the baptistry doors in Florence in 14 whenever
1491.
And which she claims is the moment when architects first claimed a certain autonomy. Certainly formed into artists and architects for the first time claimed the right to decide what is the style, what is the right way to do, and became autonomous and became independent. This is what the executive order is explicitly trying to roll back on.
Yeah. And do you think, is it something to do with contradicting Kennedy's order, in that, with that quote you mentioned about flowing from the profession to government and not the other way around? Is it partly a bold political gesture to sort of dilute some democratic legacy, or is it really about architecture?
I think there could be a component of just, sticking it to the Dems from the Republicans, and then putting in their own sort of Republican policy on federal architecture. But I think it may not necessarily be a specific critique of the Trump administration on architecture, but just in general, their attitude toward, and I'm using the term elite just as like professionals or experts in their profession, of just the outright kicking out of all those people. And I mean, I mentioned about the CDC, just the way that people have been within the Trump administration outright denying claims about the coronavirus, or through the EPA being basically stripped down to an empty shell of an organization run by a former coal executive. So it's just, just this purge of elites or professionals from every aspect of American government or sort of federal umbrella organizations that I think the executive order points toward more. So,
yeah. I'm going to see if anyone has any questions from our attendees. Everyone's on mute and your videos are off, but if anyone has a comment or a question they want to raise.
Jim Roach texted to say, very interesting, well done, Philip and Mark. I have to leave to another meeting now.
Yes, we are.
I have a question for Philip. I presume that there's other people behind this. Always we put the figurehead of Trump at the top and that he's controlling everything. But I feel like it's the other way around, that he can be controlled by other people. So who are the people in this agenda? Because if you look at Trump's building there, like it doesn't look very federal to me, or neoclassical. So we can't blame him for everything. Who do we blame?
Yeah. No, no, Trump's own relationship with architecture as he is, a real estate developer is very interesting in and of itself. But so as it's a draft executive order, it doesn't explicitly say who wrote it, but it's common knowledge within the architectural press that the National Civic Art Society, an organization in the States that propagates traditional and classical architecture, was at least consulted on this executive order. So I'd say it's more people within the profession of architecture who want a classical style of architecture, who were the main proponents of the executive order. The NCAS, for example, with the Frank Gehry Eisenhower Memorial, it's the commission was set up in 1999. They didn't choose a design until 2007, and then they did another competition process for that, I think in 2009, I think. And then the NCAS wrote a 150-page long report basically discrediting Frank Gehry for the project. So it's just been, just within that one project, there's been a huge push from the NCAS for using that as an example of how they need to revert to a traditional or classical style based on the architectural plans of like L'Enfant for Washington, D.C. So.
And do you think if they had a competition for federal building and they put it to public vote, would the 99% vote neoclassical, do you think, or should we rely on the elite architects to prevail?
Yeah, there have been a couple of reports, one conducted by Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, and also one by the Harris Group, I think, on behalf of the NCAS, and both show that there is a distinct preference from just the layperson for classical or traditional architectural styles. And my point of view on this whole thing is some new neoclassical buildings can be perfectly beautiful and well detailed and serve their purpose perfectly fine. I just don't think that there should be a federal style imposed on the profession. So it's sort of like Frank Lloyd Wright would say, that architecture needs to be in the spirit of the era and should be used in the materials and the technology of whatever period in time that you are in, and that going in a regressive manner to different styles of the past actually kind of weakens their architectural integrity. So that's sort of like where I stand within all this. But
good
no,
point.
I don't think you'd be alone there. Right?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, Ronan? Sorry, did you have a follow-up?
Oh, no, that's really well answered. Well done, Phil.
Great.
Great. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Everyone's being very quiet.
That's your dad there, Alan.
Probably.
Say hello.
Hello.
Hi, Mr. Bigger.
Unmute yourself, Alan. Unmute yourself. You're talking and down at the bottom.
Oh, sorry about that. We just thought we'd join in and see if we're getting value for our buck.
Hopefully.
Wow, that's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
We are delighted with UCD, so thank you.
Great. Where are you from? Where are you coming from this morning?
A place called Ludington on Lake Michigan in Michigan.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Thank
Should
you.
be very proud.
I just wanted to ask one final thing about maybe have you thought about it within the Irish context? And obviously we don't have the same kind of political system here, and we don't have the same. We're just different. But whether there's a risk or a precedent or leanings, or if you just had any thoughts on how that might be in Ireland.
To be perfectly honest, I haven't yet. You had mentioned, I think, in one of our earlier correspondence to do that, and I want to. It's just I haven't at the time.
No, that's why.
Quite yet. So, and I'm American if my accent doesn't give that away. So I'm very familiar with the political system in the States, whereas the Irish one is a bit daunting to me. So
there's Orla, there's just a kind of interesting, this is more historical, 18th century, is the Palladian international style, for want of a better term, went to America, went to Ireland around about the same time. So Jefferson and, I mean, indeed, the architect for the White House came from Ireland to Edward Hoban to build the White House. So that was an international style, which is said to have been inflected in both Charleston and in Dublin in a local way. There've been kind of changes or inflections to the local political situation. But you mentioned Wright, I think is a very good example of probably somebody who really wanted an American architecture, wanted to make something that wasn't just an international style, it wasn't an import. But yeah, that's all I could say in terms of the Ireland connection to this. It's more to do with the Palladian moment.
Yeah. Although I suppose we do have our own conversations about the interpretation of a national identity through architecture, at least on a contemporary level.
Yeah.
I wonder, would we get the same response if a survey was done here in terms of Trumpism?
I think this is very interesting because while we can go, isn't it terrible, the executive order and Trumpism is, doing its usual thing, isn't it awful? We are always faced with the unlovedness of our ideas as always something that, not always, but it's always it's a danger, isn't it? It's a fact that architectural inventions don't go down well very often. And something like Boston City Hall is a good example. You could say it's a fine piece of architecture, but you find it is still alienating for a lot of people, brutalism, no matter how you put it. And if deconstructivism like Geary or Zaha might be more loved, doesn't mean it's necessarily better. So these are complicated, these are difficult issues. And I think Philip's right to focus on autonomy as the big issue.
Yeah.
Rather than one style as opposed to another.
Great. Okay, well, I think we'll probably leave it there unless anyone else has any questions.
Yeah, good luck with your thesis, Philip.
No,
do you have any hopes for 2021?
Oh, I can't even begin there. But yeah.
Too far ahead. Well, we hope you finish your thesis and it turns out well. And we'll hope to see the back of Trump once and for all after.
We shall see. Soon enough, hopefully. But.
Great. Because this is our last in the series, I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers to date. We've really enjoyed the series and we are hoping to do it again next year. So if anyone on this call or watching this afterwards would like to participate, please just email us. All our contact details are on the website. So thanks very much, everybody. Have a good afternoon and goodbye.
Thanks, Orla.
Thank you.